Hello, this is Sally Ducharme, and I'm always interested in the astrology of different events that occur on a certain day. And today I'm here to talk to you about the writer David Angell. He was one of the original writers of the show Cheers. I recently watched one of the episodes and would highly recommend it. It's still a great, entertaining 24 minutes, going back into that very warm and funny world of the Cheers bar. And David Angell, unfortunately, along with his wife, were among the nearly 3,000 people who were killed on September 11th, 2001. He and his wife were returning to Los Angeles from a vacation and were on the first plane that hit the tower. Um, but I wanted to look at David Angell's chart, not just to understand the role the fate of that day played in his life, but also, where was the funny? I'm always interested to see how a comedian's planets are placed and how they aspect each other, because there's something very special about a person who can look at a humdrum event and, for example, people meeting every night in a bar, um, and turn it into just something hilarious. They just have a different lens of looking at the world than most of us do. So I looked up the birth time or birth date for David Angell and see that he was born in 1946 on April 10th. And he does not have a recorded time that I could find. So I'm looking at his chart just for the planets and how they're aspected to each other, rather than the house placements. And so we see in David's chart, first off, that 1946 kind of hit me because that was a year when Jupiter and Uranus were in trine to each other from Libra to Gemini. And this fell very prominently in the US chart. In fact, in 1946, 3 of our US presidents were born that summer. So I'll let you look that one up. But also, you think about Jupiter in the sign of Libra, which is, it takes the very Venusian things in life, pleasure and enjoyment and fun, and expands them and makes them bigger. So a Jupiter in Libra placement is good for promoting just a lot of pleasure and enjoyment on a big scale. And then in trine to Uranus and Gemini, the communicating sign of Gemini. So this 1946 was notable because it was post-war and American industries were starting to produce a lot of goods for the home. The industries that had been making things for the war were now making, refrigerators and cars, but also TV sets. And Americans were watching TV more and more that year. So isn't this interesting that a very prominent TV writer was born, as you can see, with that Jupiter-Uranus trine and an Aries sun, which sets it off really nicely because we've got that sun is in sextile to Uranus and it's in opposition to Jupiter. And so that's his personal, his spirit, the person he is individually can hook into that energy. And he just have the ability to come along at the right time to produce works of entertainment that Americans would enjoy. And so we also know that he has that Jupiter-Uranus trine in his chart, which is coming into the point of what's called a minor grand trine. This is when 2 planets are 120 degrees apart, and then another planet is at that 60-degree point between them. And so we don't know because we don't have a time chart. The moon could be anywhere from about 7 degrees Leo to about, I would say maybe 18 degrees Leo, depending on what time of day he was born. But in any case, it features very prominently into that minor grand trine along with Pluto. And so we have that Leo moon that loves to entertain, but also the Pluto there that gives it a sharpness and an ability to see beneath the surface of things. And of course, one of the shows he co-created was Frasier, which was, ironically about two psychiatrists who thought they knew everything about curing other people, but their own lives were a mess. And so this also, I think, points to the funny in his chart, that gift he had to kind of tickle our funny bones. But we also know that a writer, you want to look to Mercury in the chart. And Mercury here is in the sign of Pisces, and that little S there it tells us it was stationing to go direct. And so while he was, Mercury in Pisces struggles a bit, but the fact that it's stationing, being very close to when it's moving in one direction or another, makes it what's called loud in a chart. It's just kind of like a big emphasis put on it when a planet is stationing in a chart. So he's going to be a very mercurial person, and it's not surprising that he would end up choosing to earn his living by writing. Pisces, though, we know it as a water sign. It's opposite the sign that it's in its domicile in, so it's in detriment. So it's also considered to be in fall. So you think about Mercury that likes to be organized and to assemble facts and move in a linear manner. And you put it in the watery sign of Pisces, and it has to swim around for a while. And we know from his life that he did not just kind of exit the womb and say, I want to be a comedy writer. He struggled a lot to kind of fit in with the world that he grew up in. And so we can see then with this trine of Mercury to that Saturn and Mars conjunction in his chart. Now, this is a tough conjunction because Saturn is not happy in Cancer, Mars is not happy in Cancer. They're here in fall and in detriment. But yet I think the fall and the detriment suggests that he was at first a very conventional person, and that he was able to be successful. He went into the Army, he worked at the Pentagon. After he got out of the Army, he went into corporate America. He worked as a systems or methods analyst. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but you can see that Mercury hooking into Saturn and Mars there. He worked for an engineering company. He worked for an insurance company. So he was, on his way to leading a very conventional life. But you can imagine that an Aries, isn't going to, especially an Aries that's hooked into Uranus and Jupiter, is not going to want to just kind of put in their 30 years at a corporation and then retire to Florida and play golf. They're going to want to have a more fulfilling life. And also, we see that Mercury is very able to be disciplined because of the Saturn trine. But yet, because it's in Pisces, it's going to want to feel that what it's writing, what it's producing, what it's communicating is somehow meaningful to people. And so, in David Angell's life, he decided at the age of 31, so that was in 1977, just to throw it all up and go to Los Angeles and try his luck as a comedy writer. And so this is, we don't know exactly when that happened in his life in 1977, but we know it was in 1977. And so I did a solar return for his chart for that year. And so I'll put up his chart with the solar return chart. And we can see that what was going on in the solar return chart of that year. Of course, the sun has come back to its natal place. And also we know that at 31, he was in an 8th house perfection year. Those of you who study Hellenistic astrology know that each house is featured. Of course, we don't know which sign is on that house, but we do know it's 8th house. Even in an untimed chart, you know which house is perfecting on any given year. So 8th house, you think about something dying, something being reborn this year. So this is going to be a pivotal year for him. We also know that in this year, for everybody, we've got a square between Saturn and Uranus. We recently had something like that in 2021, which during the pandemic, we saw a lot of unrest, um, a lot of rebellion against the powers that be, and the powers that be kind of pushing back. And so that Saturn Uranus in his chart is telling us that, he's going to be feeling like all of us in 1977, that push pull. But how it affects him is important to understand by looking at how it affects his natal chart. And of course, we see, interestingly, at his solar return in April of 77, Saturn was exactly on that Pluto, that something's got to give here. I'm just not happy. This is not working out for me. And then Uranus is down here, in a square, and it's saying, do it, do it, do it. And so you can see that he's got, and then of course we know the moon is somehow tied in there as well. And I think Saturn crossing our moon could suggest a kind of giving up a means of support, maybe having to make some sacrifices financially, in order to make this move. So we know that that's kicking off in his chart in 1977. Also, we see, we want to look at Jupiter because that's something that is prominent in his chart. And Jupiter we see is entering the sign of Gemini that year. Gemini of the writer. He's got Uranus in Gemini, so it's going to expand. It's going to bring good fortune if he attempts a change. And so that's a sign that he's looking for a new path and that he's going to have some success with it. And of course, Uranus is the planet that rules television. So it's interesting that he was drawn to being writing for TV. And of course, Jupiter that year would also be making a trine to itself, setting off that Jupiter. Oops, I put in red for square, so I'll put in blue for a positive aspect. So he's got Jupiter will be making a trine to itself and with Uranus. And then also remember, it sets off that minor grand trine in his chart. So Jupiter's transits that year are very promising. It will also make a nice sextile to his Aries sun. So if he had seen an astrologer before he left, which I don't know if he did, but they would say, yeah, this could be a good year for carving out a new path. Definitely with television, and also with that Pluto moon, maybe tapping into your desire to entertain, your innate gifts, and kind of letting the genie out of the bottle a bit this year. And we do know that he went to Los Angeles, started working as a writer on Cheers, formed good partnerships there, and it went on to create the shows Frasier and Wings, and of course, multiple Emmys following. So it was a very auspicious solar return for him the year that he went to Los Angeles to become a comedy writer. We also know in the solar return chart that Mars is coming up to that Mercury, which the sign of the writer. And at the time of his solar return, remember, a solar return aspect tends to stay with us for the full year. Notice at the same time that is also creating a trine to that Saturn Mars. So most people would say, gosh, you're coming up against Saturn Mars. That could be a lot of big no's. But because it's a nice trine, and also it's going to be approaching Mercury here, which sets off a trine, that his hard work and efforts are going to pay off. So that's another good thing that was happening that year in his solar return chart. So then you also want to look at Uranus that year. Remember, it was squaring Saturn, but during his solar return, we had Mars in trine to transiting Uranus, and transiting Uranus is approaching a trine to that Saturn-Mars conjunction in his chart. So what we have here is a beautiful water grand trine. So it's almost like he got this impulse. You know, you think about water as being kind of something is just kind of sweeping us up in its tides and carrying us forward. And so that's another sign that this was a very auspicious year for him, that he would be able to tap into some innate talents, put his work out into the world, and then have all the love, all the affection, all the enjoyment coming back at him from that. And so that was the beginning of a beautiful career. He was 31 at the time of his um, uh, starting his career at Cheers. But then, the next, let's see, what would that be? 24 years were amazing in his life. And then in 2001, when he was 55, he would had another eighth house year, which of course is again another ending and beginning in our lives. And so, I almost just don't want to do this. But I'll just briefly put up the chart for September 11th, so we can see how it kind of fell in his chart. You remember he has that Uranus Jupiter that's very close to his nodes, which makes that Uranus again another planet, right? See how it's close to his north node? And that's again a planet that is loud in a chart when it's close to the north node. You think about north node is coming in, like a tide coming in, and then the south node being a tide coming out. So this is a person who could ride luck, who could capture lightning in a bottle, especially because that Uranus was so well aspected to his sun, to his Jupiter, to his moon, to Pluto. All of that was a very well placed Uranus North Node conjunction. But then, of course, we see on September 11th that Saturn is exactly on that Uranus. So that's what we know about fate, right? And fortune, that sometimes it falls in our court and sometimes it doesn't. And so, of course, we see that Pluto Saturn, that T square that was so prominent in the sky on September 11th, fell right across his Uranus and then not very far from his nodal axis itself in the chart. We also see that the nodes, the transiting nodes of the day, we know that Mars was right at the south node, that just sort of that pouring out. The enormous pain and suffering of that day, I think, is Pluto south node in Capricorn. Also, the fall of great buildings would be in the chart that day. And so the moon was, of course, at the time of the impact was approaching the north node. So there was a moon Mars opposition that day. And it's in square to his Neptune in his chart. So we know Neptune is pointed square in his chart. Also, looking at his south node too, we see that Chiron's exactly on his south node, which I still don't really have a grasp on what Chiron means in a chart, but it's, I think it always indicates great suffering. And so we've got Chiron on the south node also opposing the moon. But also, if we look at the chart, we see on that day that Venus was right on his Pluto moon. We had Venus here. And it's also in trine, approaching a trine to his sun on that day. Also in sextile to his Jupiter. And so even though, he experienced great personal tragedy, he was remembered so beautifully by all the friends, family, and of course his audience of millions of people who had loved his work over the year. And of course he died with his partner of a lifetime, Lynn. They'd been married since 1971. So this was I don't want to end on a melancholy note, but I do want to end with some great appreciation for the work that he gave. And granted, he was someone whose work went out to millions, and we all know that of the 3,000 people who died, every single person had many gifts that they shared with the people in their lives, and each loss was deeply tragic. After he died, David Angell's partners wrote that Lynn and his wife Lynn and David were devoted, faith-based, spirit-filled partners in love and life. Theirs was a journey of joy, kindness, gentleness, but it was a journey done too soon. And I certainly echo those thoughts. So thank you so much for spending some time with me and remembering this remarkable man.